During development, I'm going to store my connection string inside of the appsettings.json file that is the configuration for our web application. You might remember earlier in the course we added a message here, and I showed you how to pull this message out and display this message on a web page. Now what I want to do is provide enough information to give my DB context a connection string to get to a local DB, a SQL server. So I'm going to add an entire section here inside of appsettings.json called connection strings. For our application, we're only going to have a single connection string, but there's some flexibility here if you continue to build on the application to have multiple connection strings. Now I provide a key value pair. So this is the name of my connection string. Let's call it ODFOODB. And here's the value. And this is the piece that will be different for different database technologies. If I want to connect to my local DB, which is Microsoft SQL Server, I will have a connection string that looks like this. First of all, I specify the data source or the server or the SQL instance. And this uses the value that we just looked at inside of the SQL Object Explorer. So I want a data source equal to local DB inside of parentheses, and then double backslash because I need to escape this inside of the JSON file, MS SQL, local DB, and then I want to specify a specific database. Now this database doesn't exist on this particular server yet, but we will create it. And the way I specify a database name is to use the term initial catalog. So my initial catalog will be, let's call it ode to food. Now the entity framework will know what server to go to, the data source. It also knows what database to use, the initial catalog. And then the third piece of information that you typically find inside of a connection string are the credentials that the entity framework can use to make a connection. In the case of Windows and SQL Server, what I can do is to say, I want to use integrated security. This is essentially a way of saying use my Windows identity to connect to the SQL Server. For most other database technologies, you'll need something like a username and a password. But for LocalDB, this should be all that I need. Integrated security equals true, initial catalog is ode to food, and the data source is LocalDB, MS SQL LocalDB. Now the next question would be, how does this connection string reach my DB context so that my DB context knows how to connect? Well, that's done through an area of the application that we have also looked at previously in the course, and that is Configure Services. Inside of Configure Services, we've already told ASP.NET Core, any component that needs iRestaurant data, give them this in-memory restaurant data component. And that allows me to take an iRestaurant data as a constructor parameter nearly anywhere in the application that I might need this. I want to do something very similar with the entity framework. In fact, the entity framework provides some methods that I can use to describe the DB context that my application is going to use. And that would be the method addDBContext. And there's actually two of these here, addDBContext and addDBContextPool, which is new for this version of ASP.NET Core, and I would suggest using addDBContextPool. This will pool your DB contexts in an attempt to reuse DB contexts that have been created while the application is alive, which can lead to better performance and scalability. So I want to add a pool of DB context, specifically an ode to food DB context. And what that will allow me to do is just take an ode to food DB context as a constructor parameter, just like right now I'm just asking for iRestaurant data, and some object is magically passed in by ASP.NET Core. We'll see later in this module. Now I can just have a constructor that asks for an ode to food DB context, and one will magically be constructed and passed in to me. But this DB context is going to need some options. So let's write a small Lambda expression that will customize the options for this DB context. And specifically, what I want to do is invoke a method which is use SQL Server. This method is in the namespace Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore. And this is the method that is installing my database provider. So I'm not using SQLite, I'm not using MySQL. I am using Microsoft SQL Server with this DB context. And now the required parameter to use SQL Server is the connection string. So I have to answer the question specifically, which SQL Server do you want to use in the entire universe of SQL servers? Well, let's go to our configuration property, which has been populated with information from appsettings.json and other configuration sources, and ask it to get the connection string. And now I can just ask for a connection string by name. So if I name this ode to food DB, then I can copy that string, bring it back to startup.cs, and paste it in here. And so now I'm saying I want to use SQL Server, and I want to use SQL Server with this connection string that you will find somewhere in our configuration sources. And I have now configured an application where I can use my ODFOOD DB context to talk to my local DB. But there's one more bit of code that I need to add. Over here in my ODFOOD DB context, I need to provide enough code so that the framework can pass in the connection string and the other options that this DB context needs to know about to work with the database. And I can do that by adding a constructor to my DB context and have this constructor take an object of type DB context options of T, where T is ODFOOD DB context. We'll call this options. And yes, there's lots of options inside of these options, but there's really nothing that I need to do with the options here inside of my code. What I can do is simply forward those options to my base class constructor, so the DB context constructor, and that constructor can figure out what to do with all the information inside of this object. So now I have an ODFOOD DB context that can take connection options and provider options. I have services configured so that I can ask for an ODFOOD DB context inside of any component. Now I just need to take a step towards having a workable database using the Entity Framework migrations.